Justice isn't just about the law. It's about the people who fight for it. I'm Jennifer Long, CEO of AEquitas, where justice isn't a concept, it's a commitment. And this is Just Champions. This season, we're doing something new. We're looking at the ways sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking crimes are portrayed in film, TV, and documentaries. Together with my guests, we'll explore how we'd approach these cases if they landed on our desks today, the strategies we'd use, what the law says now, and how we'd support victims in and out of the courtroom to set up the best possible outcomes. Because the law isn't just theory. It's the foundation of real lives, real cases, and real change. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to a new season of Just Champions. This week, we're going to be talking about two documentaries that involve image-based sexual abuse. The first one discusses crimes that happened in 1996. The second involves much more recent crimes and actually involves deepfake images. And both chronicle very similar dynamics, and yet they also cover very unique aspects of this crime. And the documentaries we're going to be talking about today are Pamela, A Love Story, which was directed by Ryan White and released in 2023, and Another Body, which was directed, written, and produced by Sophie Compton and her team, and it was also released in 2023. And joining me today to take a deep dive into the crimes depicted in these documentaries is AEquitas Attorney Advisor Kerri New. And hey, Kerri, I've often said if I were the victim of a crime, I would want to have Kerri as the DA assigned to my case. One of the things that will always stick with me is that she delayed her start time at AEquitas so that she could keep and try a domestic violence homicide that she had on her case, that she was working with families, with the family around, and just her dedication. I will really never forget that. Kerri has been a prosecutor in Texas for 17 years, and she's worked in both the Dallas County District Attorney's Office and the Rockwall County Criminal DA's Office. And there she served as the chief of the Family Violence Division. She has also served on the Public Policy Committee for the Texas Council on Family Violence and as a board president of Women in Need, which is a local domestic violence shelter and a resource center. So you can see one of the types of people that we have working at AEquitas and why we're so lucky to have her. Hi, Kerri.
Hi, thank you for that.
Of course. No, of course. And as you know, today, we're going to be talking about image-based sexual abuse. And because we're talking about the crimes as they're depicted in two different documentaries, I want to summarize these in case people listening aren't familiar. I want to start with first Another Body. And Another Body addressed deepfake image-based abuse. And in essence, deepfake is a kind of generative artificial intelligence where it creates new content based on data that it's using and analyzing. The thing I love about these documentaries is that they're from the victim, the survivor's point of view. They're spoken to by the survivor, although interestingly, Another Body. In Another Body, it dealt with a college student who discovered that she was the victim of a deepfake crime that was depicting her in pornography, in sexual activities that she did not participate in, and she certainly didn't consent to the creation of this material. And that material was posted on the internet and disseminated. And in the course of this discovery, there were other victims that were discovered, and it really takes us through that victim's search for justice and her discovery of the limitations of the law at that time. And I think that documentary is very instrumental in that. Survivor was very instrumental in getting us to where we are today in the state of the laws, which we'll talk about. The second documentary that we focus on today is Pamela, A Love Story. It was slightly different in that the content had been created consensually between a husband and a wife and meant to stay private. And that content was stolen. It was put on a videotape, put in a safe. That content was stolen. It was disseminated first by videotape, but interestingly, then on the internet. I think Pamela Anderson doesn't get enough credit for really raising this issue, raising consciousness and awareness about this issue, and for really exposing the disrespectful way that the public treats individuals based on their determination if a victim is worthy enough of their sympathy and blameworthy. So these are the two cases. And I guess what I want to start by asking you, and I want to start with Pamela Love's story. If you had a case like that come across your desk, what's the first thing that you're doing to connect with the victim? And there may be steps that you take before this. So what are you doing when that case comes across your desk?
In order to come across my desk as a prosecutor, it would have to be filed by law enforcement, right? And that's sort of the first barrier to services, I think, that victims, especially a victim in a situation like Pamela Anderson was then, because she was a very sexualized public figure, right? And, even if the laws existed then to criminalize that behavior, it would have likely been very difficult for her to get over that initial hump of getting law enforcement to recognize the criminality of this behavior. So if that case did get filed by law enforcement and did end up on my desk as a prosecutor, connecting with the victim is first and foremost going to be the biggest priority, right? We have to understand where the victim is, what her priorities are, meet her where she is, provide support in whatever way that we can. In many aspects, that's pretty limited, especially when you're dealing with image-based abuse post-internet era, right? Because Pam Anderson's story largely starts before internet intervention. But in this post-internet world, resources that speak to the kind of harm that victims experience in this scenario are really few and far between. I mean, what can you do? You can't unring the bell, right? It is an ongoing harm. Every second of every minute of every day of every week of every month, they are continuing to be violated because it exists out there in the big wide web. And so connecting with the victim, understanding what she's experiencing in terms of harm and detriment, and then working with her to try to meet whatever needs we can as we then start proceeding through the criminal justice process would be priority one.
So one thing we know about perpetration, right, is that as tech advances, the base abuse is the same. So let's just assume that today we have a case where the abuse is captured very old school on film or on something that's contained. And that is, it starts like this and then physically stolen from a victim. And that we're working really from today. Because the other thing is I want to say, we're using this crime as a way of talking also about, we understand most of the victims are not in the public eye. And yet most of them really are. They do face a lot of the same blame and shame. In fact, as we'll talk about another body, those victims actually also face in the beginning. So I'm wondering if you could tell me, if you're assuming that this case is coming to you as a theft, that this was reported first, when you're meeting with the victim, what's your focus and what's the kind of evidence you're going to have and what's the kind of follow-up you're going to be hoping that your investigators have done or that you're going to be needing to proceed in a case like this?
It kind of depends upon how we're proceeding, right? Are we prosecuting the theft? Are we prosecuting the actual theft of the images? Or are we prosecuting the distribution of the images? Because those are often two different things in two different people.
And I think knowing how you are when you're being presented with the fact that all of this has happened because you are, were aware from watching this documentary that not only have images been stolen, they've been disseminated. And in this way, if you remember they're put as a montage. So in some ways it's like recreated and then released at hard copy and then online. So knowing you and knowing that your goal is always to try to grab the biggest scope of the crime and get the justice, what are you going to do?
And there's an aspect even that goes further than that too, because when you watch this documentary, she was then, that story was then hijacked again by Hulu, and they did an entire sort of docuseries or something, but without the permission of Pamela Anderson or Tommy Lee. And so it is just a perpetuation of that same violation that occurred originally. And I think that as a prosecutor, I'm going to hope that the investigation into the theft, and I have no knowledge and of whether, of how that went or how hard they worked to try to determine who perpetrated that theft.
Oh yeah, we're not going to Monday morning quarterback this. Let's just figure that it has come to you.
I'm not going to let go of that. That is the first violation, the theft. And then the idea that those images, that intensely personal information can be taken and then sold, which it clearly was, to someone who is then promoting. And I think when we read our current laws, we throw around all these terms of dissemination, promotion, and they all have different meanings, but they all capture different criminality as well. And so
Can you talk about that? What
Sure.
you mean by that?
Sure. This is using this as a great example of sort of highlighting why we want to be able to criminalize different aspects of this crime, these image-based crimes, because the person who initially stole the images, that was a wrong, right? But then they clearly sold those images, and it was cut up and processed and sort of created into something else. And then that person was either sold that, which was promoted by someone else, or that person was promoting that to make their own money back, right? They bought a product and now they're using that product to make money for themselves, to profit from it. And then at a later point, when the internet became a thing in the middle of this whole sort of debacle, a promotion company, and now this company, that's all they do is promote pornography, right? They approached Pamela Anderson and said, "Hey, we've got it. We're gonna, let me pay you some money, and we're gonna make a bunch of money off this." And she said no, and then they did it anyway. And so the laws that we have today, and we're learning, back then these laws didn't exist, but the laws that we have today are meant to reach out and grab criminality from every vantage point of the wrong that is done in this scenario.
One thing that really struck me, and I think you've alluded to it here, and it kind of takes me back to our first meeting with our victim in this case. So one of the things that struck me in this documentary was that Pamela Anderson discusses having the opportunity. They didn't have the criminal laws, but they did have the opportunity to try to seek recourse. And the impacts to her psychologically, the concerns physically, to me, it illustrated these barriers, so often minimized, but all of these barriers in real life that have victims and their families. And I know we're focusing on Pamela Anderson. Obviously, Tommy Lee was also a victim here. I really don't want to, erase that in any way. But the barriers that they faced, the concerns about what this would open them up to, and by the way, not baseless concerns, because other things that were really horrifying to watch was the total treatment, the joking, the disrespect, and the headlines, and those are headlines we still see today, really minimizing what had happened to these two. We may not have had a crime at the time, but it was such reprehensible behavior, what happened to them. And then the laughing about it. It's a good mirror for what victims rightly can fear are going to happen when they come forward, that their lifestyle, their consensual lifestyle that they have every right to live and have every right to have dignity for it, is going to be put out on display and criticized and picked apart. So again, in that meeting, I know we can't, as prosecutors, we can't prevent everything, but what are the types of things that you talk to about victims to try to, I don't want to say put them at ease, we want to be honest with them, but have them able and willing to participate in the prosecution of the case?
Half the battle is making sure that your victim understands that you don't have those feelings. You as the prosecutor, you as law enforcement. we can acknowledge, and part of our job is to acknowledge with the victims to set expectations, right? I would feel terrible if I didn't do a good job of preparing my victim for these possibilities, because I know that that's how the system works, right? I know that regardless of how hard I try to protect her and how well prepared I am to use the laws that we have available to protect victims to keep some of this from happening, I also know I won't be able to successfully protect her from all of it. And so you have to have those hard conversations. It's a catch-22, because the better job you do of preparing your victim for those expectations, the harder it is to get a victim to be willing to go forward under those circumstances. And I think Pamela's ultimate decision to drop the lawsuit against that promotion company was utterly understandable, given what she was going through and the backlash that she was facing publicly just from daring to say this is not right. And again, that goes back to who she was, what her public image was, and people believing that basically anything of a sexual nature about her was fair game because of the public image that she had. That goes all the way back to basic consent. You can consent to one thing and not to another, right? And the old adage about a woman can walk down the street naked, it does not invite the criminal behavior. It doesn't make her responsible for any criminality that a perpetrator may blame on the fact that there was an opportunity in there from their perspective.
And I have one other, I don't mean to interrupt a thought, but just one other question, and this gets a little bit to the facts of another body, but, assuming in these meetings, because I feel like in Pamela Anderson, as you pointed out in the beginning, look, this comes in as a theft case. There's maybe a lot of questions as to who a perpetrator is. And again, I'm filling in that maybe you're in a jurisdiction where you can have interactions, or it's a crime of a nature where you're going to have an interaction with the victim before some of these are settled. In another body, because we're dealing with more recent behavior, there's still questions, who's the perpetrator and deep fake images. Can you talk a little bit about what's available to you to try to answer some of these questions? The perpetrator, finding evidence. Can you talk about some of the tools you have? I know we're still at the investigative stage, and we'll move on to trial and everything, that you can try to fill in some of these holes that exist today.
Well, digital evidence collection is a huge part of just about any investigation in current times, right? But specifically in image-based abuse, you absolutely have to use and have to have access to tools and to investigators who know how to use the tools that are available to collect digital evidence. And digital evidence can come in a trillion different forms, right? Just about anything you can do on your phone or computer, that evidence can be collected and preserved. I have found as a prosecutor, I can't keep up with the newest and the best and even the improved ways of using those tools, or even what those tools are, because software changes so quickly. And so I prosecuted in the latest part of my career in a smaller jurisdiction. And so we had to work very hard to connect with experts who could help us uncover some of these things. Chasing down digital signatures through multiple postings and possessions of image-based abuse is incredibly difficult. It is not impossible. There are people in the world that can facilitate that. And as lawyers, it ain't us. But we have to do a couple of things. We have to cultivate relationships. We have to educate our law enforcement, our first responders, our investigators, but also our own offices, because the resources to devote to those kinds of relationships and expert use have to be made available to us, or we are utterly incapable of getting the bad guy in these image-based abuse cases and these digital evidence-based cases. And getting the bad guy means expending resources on providing access to the tools that we need to do that.
And, moving into from an understanding that obviously the investigation is methodical and moving through, but when we're taking something to trial and preparing for, the first place, I know we're preparing for trial, but maybe preparing for legal motions, you think you're going to file proactively, or those that you want to be, you are anticipating the defense might file and you want to be ready for. Using these cases, the scenarios in these two documentaries, what type of motions are you anticipating when you're dealing an image-based sexual abuse case, and how do you prepare for that?
Always, and always in cases with victims where you're dealing with intimate visual material, motions in limine are going to be key, right? That's a key tool that we use to protect our victims and to set boundaries up front. You don't ever want to walk into a trial in a case like this without having set some very clear boundaries legally for what can and can't be asked, said, shown, or, ways of behaving, because there is the potential for abuse in the system even as it's operating as it's supposed to. It's not even just the potential for it. There is the promise of it is a certainty that if you don't use the tools that are available to you to set those really clear boundaries, your victim is going to be unnecessarily brutalized by the process.
And to be clear, we're talking about harassed, humiliated attempts on the stand through questions and
Correct.
through innuendo and things. And of course, as prosecutors, we're interested in a fair trial. We understand people have a constitutional right. Of course, let's test the evidence, but there are bounds. And that's why these motions in limine, which are, I'm going to wrongly call them the catch-all motion, but that set the bounds for the behavior in the trial.
Right. And it's a way to build fences before you walk into the courtroom, because again, once the damage is done, once the question is asked, once the image is shown in a disrespectful or a hurtful way, or a humiliating way, then it's hard. You can't unring that bell, And so the laying out those boundaries in advance, that's really the best tool that we have to do that, is the motion in limine. Then the judge rules on it, and then the rule is in place and they can't do it. And if they do, there are consequences. And so that's just a critical component of trying these cases.
So I think maybe this is one of the specific motions you would be alluding to in there, but to be clear, rape shield motions. So motions where the defense is trying to, typically improperly, which is why we proactively file these oftentimes, bring in other totally irrelevant sexual behavior of the victim that truly is irrelevant to consent or to credibility, to anything else. And so is that one of the motions you're thinking about, or others?
It is, and it isn't. Rape shield laws are dependent upon the way that the information is being used or how it's trying to be used. And so, in so many situations where we're dealing with sexual assault or image-based abuse, the fact that the victim is saying, "This hurt me," opens the door into the use, all sorts of usages that on their face would appear to be disallowed because of the rape shield protections. And so while, yes, I'm going to use that tool if and when I can and how I can, it is far less protection than it looks to be on its face.
You're not going to sit back and think you're going to be able to rely on it. You're going to be prepared to counter that when it happens. How about, are there any defense motions about illegal searches or other aspects that you might
always
be preparing?
Yeah. Where digital evidence is concerned, particularly, they want to challenge the search of the device that led to the digital evidence, right? That is defense 101. In a case where there is damning digital evidence for their client, they're always going to want to, rather than deal with the evidence on its face, they're going to want to try to avoid the admissibility of that evidence. And so their search warrant challenges are very, very common in these cases. And they generally rely on technicalities, right? And so, again, that's working with law enforcement, making sure that they understand what the requirements are and can work within those. But also having great relationships with law enforcement so that when they have a question or a concern in the investigatory process, that they can seek advice on those particular legal issues. And that is sometimes makes the difference between a search warrant that you can rely on and one that's going to fail you.
And I think just by working with you too, sometimes when I say over preparing these cases, in that, I think about another body. Okay, yes, there's the digital evidence that they were able to identify and download, but there were also witnesses who saw that online. They saw it themselves online. So you have stacks of evidence, if you will, that you are not overly reliant on one piece of evidence if it's excluded. And, we've made assumptions here because both of these documentaries, as people, when they watch them, there are some question marks about identified perpetrator, but maybe not. But assuming we're in court and we've got a defendant at this case, we've prepared the motions, what's your trial strategy? What are the top 3 things that you're going to prioritize in getting this trial?
That's maybe a very different answer depending upon which set of facts we're going on here. Because, we have Pamela's story in which our approach is going to be different simply because the scenario is different. In the other story, that's very much more what our society would consider a true victim situation, right? They did nothing, didn't put themselves out there in a way that led to that creation of those deepfakes. Whereas, society was going to say that Pamela Anderson very much put herself in the public eye and participated in her own sexualization. And so the approach is going to be very different in those trials. But in terms of how I'm going to deal with the perpetrator in a Pamela Anderson type situation, I am going to work very hard to connect my jury to my victim as a person. And helping them and watching that documentary, you can't help but identify with the situation that Pamela was in and how it was impacting her in a personal way. But making those connections between your jury or your judge, whoever the trier of fact is, and your victim is going to be crucial because the whole defense tactic is going to center around establishing that this victim is not worthy of justice. Through, a myriad of means, through, character assassinations, but also through just almost derision of the way that she chose to live her life and the decisions that she made. And so I will work very hard to do that. I will also have to know my case and my evidence and my defendant better than he knows himself. Because this is a situation where, and so many of these cases are, because they're largely, Pamela Anderson's was not, but they are often co-occurring crimes with domestic abuse, right? And so the perpetrator, the person that is disseminating or promoting or profiting off of or hurting the victim, is a person who has a relationship with the victim. And in those cases, it's almost always going to be a situation where the perpetrator is going to testify. They're going to be charming. They're going to villainize the victim while making themselves look like the victim or the hero of the story. And the only way that you can combat that is with the details, is knowing the details better than they do.
Yeah, it is, and just recounting it always makes me think back. It is really a devastating constant. And I was a prosecutor back in the late 90s, all the way through today, that we still have this concept that we are fighting and rejecting this somehow unworthy victim, unworthy of justice, that any decision that victim made somehow makes them unworthy of justice, incredible. And I always feel like it's you have your victims who have so much courage to get up and tell their story. And I think it's very empowering to take that control and to testify. And I think it's such it's such an honor, really, to be by their side and to help facilitate their ability to testify about what happened to them and to together denounce what a defendant did and to demand justice.
When they say, when they're making those arguments where they're basically saying, she did this and she did this and she did this, and so you should find him not guilty.
Exactly.
Being able to stand up and say, that's wrong. They're trying to assert that she doesn't have the right of the protections of the laws of this country, and that's wrong. I think that win or lose, that is healing for victims, to have someone stand in front of a crowd and say, what was done to her is wrong and you should hold this person accountable.
And that's a message that needs to be repeated and everyone needs to hear it. Even if they walk out of there and do the wrong thing, maybe it makes them pause and think about what they should have done the next time. You know, knowing that the state of the law is different, and because of a project you and I work on together, I know how deeply you have dived into the laws on image-based sexual abuse. And we have this great new law, Take It Down Act, which is a federal. So, of course, it's not going to impact state actions necessarily, but it might influence the way those laws move. Can you talk just briefly about the impact of different laws across the country and how that impacts the approach to the cases?
Absolutely. The biggest impact it has, I think the biggest impact Take It Down will have across all jurisdictions is the conversation. Because now all of a sudden, people are talking about this behavior that is now newly being criminalized or newly being assessed liability. And you know, Take It Down Act criminalizes the non-consensual distribution of images, but it also assigns liability to the sites, the third-party sites who had been absolutely protected prior to this. And victims had found it very difficult, even when they notified these third-party sites that there were non-consensual images that had been posted. Even when they notified them of that, they still couldn't get the response that they needed to even remove that. So to stop the harm from perpetuating. And so I think the Take It Down Act does a lot of great things, that being, you know, one of the biggest. But I think the biggest impact it's going to have across all states and territories in the United States and maybe internationally, because it is the conversation about accepting where the liability lies here and where we need to place blame and where we need to create affirmative obligations to act in order to stop the continuation of the harm that's being done in these kinds of cases.
You've summarized, 50 states and the territories, a lot of law in that short summary. So I appreciate it. And I really appreciate, I could talk to you all day and, would want to go through these files piece by piece all day with you to set them up and get ready for trial, which is, what I know you spend a lot of your time doing when prosecutors call in. But as we end, I do have 3 quick questions or personal questions. And, you should feel free to say whatever comes to mind that I like to close with.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
So the first one is, since we're working on films for this season, if a film or movie was made about your work as a prosecutor, what detail would you insist that they get right?
I never watch legal shows because I end up screaming at the TV. That's not how that works. That's not how that works. So off the top of my head, I would say the authenticity is absolutely imperative. And authenticity in this context means some terrible things. It means the terrible treatment of victims and the cost of a victim to find justice, to get to justice. That would absolutely be the line in the sand. If there was not authenticity as to what the cost to victims of justice, then I would not be interested.
Do you think, this is my second question, you've sort of answered it, so I would ask you, do you think Hollywood gets that right when it shows these cases?
Yeah, sometimes, but rarely. People want a happy ending, and the happy ending for victims of crime, especially victims of domestic abuse or sexual violence or these image-based crimes, the happy ending is not very happy. And what it costs them to get it is sometimes too high. And, Pamela is a great example of that. She pulled out of that case. And the prosecutor in me wants to rail against that because you're contributing to the perpetuation of the idea that you don't deserve justice when you back away from that, But in reality, of course she did. That was terrible. And she just decided for her own benefit that the cost was too high and she removed herself from it. And she has that right.
And finally, why does the work matter to you personally, this work?
At its most basic level, because right is right and wrong is wrong. And people who do this kind of wrong have not been held accountable to any degree, even close to the harm that they've caused the victims that it's perpetrated against. And I will go to my grave in some form or fashion trying to hold folks accountable for wrong.
I can't think of a better way to end this. And I cannot think of how to thank you today for really stepping up and walking through how you would approach these cases and the really important critical issues for the victims. Thank you so, so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me and giving me the opportunity. And I think it's so incredibly important.
Thanks, Kerri. This podcast discusses the violent crimes of sexual violence, domestic violence, stalking, and human trafficking. If you need support, please check the show notes for links to hotlines and agencies that can help. For more information about AEquitas, please go to AEquitasResource.org. That's AEquitas resource.org, or follow us at AEquitas_resource on Instagram. This series is executive produced by Jennifer Long, AEquitas, and Robin Hopkins. This series is sound designed and edited by Dan Kroll. This season of Just Champions is funded by a generous grant from the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, supporting efforts to improve justice in cases of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, and human trafficking. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women.